had 10 years to reflect what it felt like the first time I met Helen and the two of you. And there's no question in my mind that something enormously important happened to me that day. I was sitting with you both at Columbia University School of Physicians and Surgeons, and with you, Bill and Helen, in the faculty dining room. And I had the feeling as if I was coming together with more than old friends, but family, and yet we'd never met each other before. I was so taken with Helen. I was both drawn to her and a bit put off by her very crisp manner of speaking, her extremely polished intellect, which was so visible right away, and more than anything else, how impeccable she was about herself. I remember being conscious at the time of wanting to disguise my Brooklyn accent. I wanted to speak as she did, and I wanted to be as insightful, and I know I wanted to be as positive, because there was a certain certitude about her. And when she spoke, it's as if she knew exactly what she was saying. At least that was an early first impression, and first impressions do last. Physically, when I was able to be more relaxed and I took a look at her, I was immediately noticing her very lovely frosted hair, like a blonde halo around her head. Helen is even smaller than I, which was wonderful, 5 feet tall barely, and quite slim. And she held herself with such beautiful posture. I noticed that too right away. I had a feeling this woman was very familiar with exercise. I also remember thinking at the time, I wish she would like me. I wanted so much for her to approve of me. But this is all that happened in the first few moments, because I had a feeling that something important was happening, but I didn't know what it was, and that I was going to ask that lady a question, and I didn't know what it was, but it was going to be very intimate. And suddenly, while we were just speaking at the table, I did find myself, without even knowing why I was saying it, touch her hand and look at her and say, "You're hearing an inner voice, aren't you?" Of course, she was stunned. And she said, "I beg your pardon." And I wanted to bite my tongue off. Do you know why?
I think Helen, you obviously startled her because this was her guilty secret. And I think this was something that Helen had kept hidden for so long, and all of a sudden here was a strange lady coming in and kind of just exposing everything and blowing it all away. And there's no question in her mind, I think, in her retrospecting afterwards, that she recognized you too, and that Judy was her family, and was obviously the next step in the greater plan in terms of the course. And that was, I think, a momentous day for all of us.
But you know, I never did understand, and you know, I never asked you this. Why did she agree to meet with me?
Well, that was a kind of highly charged day. I had told Helen that I thought it was time we told someone who had a foundation about Course in Miracles that she was due to retire the following month, and that we were going to have to do something about perpetuating the course. So that was partly why she was so uptight. She recognized that this was the day when we were going to talk about that, and when Helen became extremely formal, that meant that she was very anxious.
Well, she was formal that day, and after a while, of course, she dropped that reserve with me, and I saw much more, many layers behind that particular form of Helen. And it's the layers, though, that how can one possibly describe what a complex person this was? So extremely meticulous and articulate and very, very capable, and at the same time controlling and soft and vulnerable and warm and neurotic.
I think that's true, Judy. She had all those same qualities that we all have, except she seemed to have them to a more extreme degree somehow. And it was more notable when you were talking with Helen that she could be either the research scientist, be extremely precise, be very exact, handle data with precision, speak with authority, or she could be something totally different when she became upset. So I think all of the range of human emotions and feelings were somehow a part of Helen's psyche, and one tuned in on various aspects at different times. Sometimes very quickly there would be a change from one persona to another, and that could be confusing.
I think this was something that confused a lot of people with Helen. I think Helen had so many different sides, and she was very good at presenting just the side that she felt was appropriate to the situation, what the person would like. And then as people became more familiar with her and more comfortable with her, then they would see other layers, the kind of thing that you were just talking about, Bill. Moments of real anger and judgment and criticalness, and then moments of very tenderness and graciousness and sweetness. Moments of real holiness when you could just feel a real wisdom coming through her that you knew was not her. But as Bill was saying, she would just go back and forth instantaneously. And that could be very disconcerting, I think, for us and for everybody.
Something that stunned me so, I think at this moment, she wasn't aware of what she did. We were sitting in our home one day in the library, and Susan Lamb was with us. And Susan is a lovely, sweet, intelligent woman. I think she's the daughter Helen would have loved to have had if she ever had a child. She was blonde and blue-eyed and very svelte, and also very, very soft. And Helen was sitting on the couch holding Susan's hand and looking into her eyes, and she said to me, "Judy, did you ever show Susan my poetry?" Well, Helen's poetry was even more of a deep, dark, guilty secret than, of course, in Miracles, which by this time, of course, was published. And Susan was kind of stunned. She said, "Oh, Helen, you've written poetry? I didn't know that." And Helen says, "Yes, I have some poetry." She said, "It came the same way as the course, but it's much more personal to me." She said, "Judy, why don't you show it to Susan?" And of course, I was feeling as if I was the bad girl because I hadn't shown it to Susan. Of course, I wasn't allowed to show it to anyone. And I went and I got it and I handed it to Helen to give to Susan. And Helen handed it to her. She said, "Here it is, dear. It's so beautiful. I hate it."
It's a good story.
And a typical one.
Yes, yes. And certainly her feelings about the course were just like that, too. I think that she certainly recognized it as being her life's work. Certainly devoted all of her time and energy to it, and yet there was a part of her that hated it because she felt it destroyed her professional career. And yet there was an inner compulsion in her not to ever put it down, not to do it. And that kind of ambivalence, I think, ran through almost everything Helen did.
I think partly when Helen made a commitment to do something, she followed through. So that when we had made our commitment to do this course, she felt that was really her assignment and that she was going to fulfill her function no matter what the personal cost might be. But she could also resent it bitterly at the same time and remain in conflict.
You know, one of the things that comes to mind as we recall our stories about her is how she really didn't identify with this course as something important in her personal life. I know she knew its value, and believe me, she knew what it said. But she didn't see it as something really significant to her, such as attending a wonderful opera that she might love, or a Gilbert and Sullivan musical. One day we were sitting in our apartment, and a lovely young man was paying homage to her, really, because he was so taken with the course. He was a very avid student, and his father had developed a large sound studio in New York, and he was the heir apparent, and he had traveled all over the world, and he was telling us about his travels to Africa and to India. He was one of the first people I'd ever known who'd gone on an animal safari. This was years ago, and we both listened, and we were kind of awestruck at this young man's wide experience. And when he was all finished, and probably pausing for breath, Helen looked at him and she said, "Oh, my dear, you've had such a fascinating life. Nothing ever happens to me." I think she never really owned the course personally. She, in the truest sense of the word to me, she was a pass-through or a channel. She was a messenger, and she delivered the message. But she really didn't take it for herself, although we should never make a mistake in thinking she didn't know what it said.
Helen really knew the course was true, but she refused to believe it or accept it consistently. And I think in many ways that actually represented her integrity. She recognized that if she fully accepted the teachings of the course, it was going to mean a very major shift in her perception about absolutely everything. And she felt unprepared to do that. So she took the fairly honest position that I can't do that and I'm not about to try. Helen had a vast array of obsessional fears. I think we're all familiar with people who have to jump every other crack on the sidewalk or they become uncomfortable. Well, Helen had that same kind of symptom multiplied over and over in practically every area of her life. And that's why it became so overwhelming and overpowering for her in trying to deal with this.
And I know that during the period when you, Bill, were kind of typing out what Helen had dictated, there was a lot of fear associated with that, with Helen.
Oh, yes. At the very beginning, I used to hold on to Helen with one hand while I was trying to type with the other. Of course, I had my own problems. I would misspell things like salvation. I think I spelled that slavation. And
crucifixion.
So we were both going through our various forms of anxiety. But Helen found it so painful to even read it aloud. It was difficult enough to put it in shorthand, which was 1 degree removed since she didn't actually have to read it in writing. But then when I would type it up, it took on some sort of reality for her, and again, that increased her fears.
Yes, indeed. And I remember during the time I was going over the course with her for the final time, actually preparing ourselves for you, even though we didn't know that at that moment. I'd be sitting with Helen on her couch, and we'd be kind of going over something in the course, and all of a sudden she'd start kind of slumping in her chair like that, and yawning, and then coughing, and then kind of laughing at herself at the same time. So you could imagine someone coughing, yawning, and laughing, and this was a kind of very common experience with her. It just made her so fearful.
As I remember, one of her famous lines I thought was, "I can see your lips moving, but I can't hear a word you're saying."
Right.
Wouldn't hear a word you were saying was more like it. It was the time that she was asked by a friend of ours, "Helen, what do you really think about the course?" And they'd had a nice preamble of a conversation before this, and they were getting to be good friends. He was an academician, she was too, and they had a common ground. And finally, wanting so much to share with her his experience of A Course in Miracles and what it had done in his life, in fact, it was Willis Harmon, he said to her, "Helen, tell me what you really think about it." And she thought for a second, should she give it to him straight? And then she said, I know it's true, Bill. I just don't believe it. And I said to her, "Helen, I think you made a mistake there. And the mistake is in one letter. And the letter is, you made it a D in don't instead of a W for won't. I know it's true, I just won't believe it." Because it was volitional.
Yes.
And she really chose
That's
to
really what the Course
represent
teaches.
herself as not believing it. I could say, though, that as much coughing and spluttering and laughing and choking as she did, or not wanting to hear the words and so being deaf to them, when it came to helping somebody, it was an entirely different situation. When she was the one who was on stage, so to speak, to take it down, to have to check it over and make sure as you typed it was correct, then she reacted that way. But all the times she was acting as my spiritual teacher when I came into the scene, after the course was completely scribed, she would read me parts of it aloud in a voice that was purely helpful and explaining to me what certain passages meant when I was blocked because my defenses wouldn't let me truly hear. There was one time in particular when I was fearful, and she was able to help me understand that and reverse it totally. It had to do with a dream, which was very short but very powerful. And in the dream, I felt I was just a speck of consciousness, not a person, but an awareness, traveling through space, minding my own business, perfectly happy in a field that was forever, like a void. And suddenly, out of the corner of my awareness, like over there, I envisioned a big black salad bowl. I know that's absurd, but that's what it looked like, a big ebony salad bowl. And somehow or other, I was totally terrified by this salad bowl. And I didn't want to see it at all. I didn't want to know it's there, so I tried to speed up in another direction, but I kept getting pulled as if it was a magnet to it. And the closer I got, the more fearful I was. And it was awful. I was shaking internally with this fear. And finally, there I was, suspended above it. Not because I wanted to be, but because the power of it drew me. And suddenly I opened my eyes, metaphorically, and I looked down, and instead of a big black salad bowl, was the most beautiful, translucent, iridescent, lavender crystal bowl. It was so beautiful, I had to catch my breath. And I woke up stunned by the dream. I didn't know what it meant, and I was really upset. And when Helen came over later that day for a visit, I told her the story. And she looked at me and she said very kindly, "Kitten, don't you know what that was all about?" And I said, "No, I don't." And she said, "Well, you just faced your guilt, and you found out it wasn't real." And it was true, somehow or other. The fear went away, my problems at that moment disappeared, and I recognized symbolically the illusory nature of my fear and of my guilt, and it was gone.
The interesting thing with Helen was that many times I would be with Helen when she'd be giving people very good advice, just as she had done with Judy, very sound interpretations and very insightful and very helpful. And then the person would leave and I'd say to Helen, "Did you ever listen to what you told that person?" Always hoping against hope that she would have, and would have some kind of generalization to herself. And she would all say, "No, I didn't pay attention to a word of it." And I'm sure that's exactly what happened with you.
What about the time you asked her if she had consulted Jesus about a problem that she had?
She was very angry at Jesus one day, and I was sitting with her on the couch. We were always on the couch, and she was going on and on to me about what a rotten person Jesus was, that she had done his work, but he didn't fulfill his promises to her. And she was just carrying on. I finally said to her, "Helen, why don't you ask Jesus himself? Don't burden me with this. It's between you and him." So she finally calmed herself down sufficiently, and she asked Jesus, "How come you haven't helped me more?" And his answer to her really knocked her for a loop, because she wasn't expecting it. He said to her, "Because you're so ashamed of me." He just burst into tears at that point. A very, very moving moment.
Yeah, that dichotomy in her, that she would deny and at the same time seek. I think this was pivotal in that inner personal struggle that she was always having.
Yeah. I think probably one of the most favorite stories we all have with Helen is the one with the Lord's Prayer, which I think was probably one of the most moving experiences Helen had. And maybe you should tell that, Bill.
Yes. Well, Helen was always afraid that somehow the course was going to flip. And she said, "I'll be responsible for the grammar, or, I'll look after it in terms of style, but I don't want to know what it says." But she was always afraid that it might say something terrible, and if it did, that would also reflect adversely upon her. One day she came into my office while we were working on the text, and she was simply in tears. She was terribly upset. She was angry. She had every possible sign of lack of tranquility and peace of mind. And she said, "This time it's really flipped. It's had it, and it doesn't make any sense at all." And I said, "Well, why don't we type it up and take a look at it, and maybe we'll get some idea of what it really does say." So at the end of that section, there is a passage which is so beautiful that when we had typed it up together, she burst into tears. "Forgive us our illusions, Father, and help us to accept our true relationship with you, in which there are no illusions, and where none can ever enter. Our holiness is yours. What can there be in us that needs forgiveness when yours is perfect? The sleep of forgetfulness is only our unwillingness to accept your forgiveness and your love. Let us not wander into temptation, for the temptation of the Son of God is not your will. And let us accept only what you have given, and receive but this into the minds which you created and which you love. Amen."
No wonder she burst into tears when you read it out loud.
And at that point, Helen totally dissolved and recognized that despite the fury of her protests, that this was a tremendously powerful, beautiful section, which really is the course's equivalent of the Lord's Prayer.
I think that the constant conflict that Helen had was that she, number one, had many, many experiences where she really felt the love of God within her and could feel that love extending through her. But there was no way that became an integrated part of her her life. I think that was a constant source of conflict for her and of guilt for her. And I think that was a burden that she was never really freed from, that she knew exactly what the Course said. She had so many experiences which demonstrated what the Course said and of the love of God for her. But in no way was it possible for her to apply that in her personal relationships, in her concerns of elevator strikes or paint chips falling from her bedroom onto her bed in the middle of the night, or
her husband leaving the room.
Husband, right, and just a myriad number of anxieties and fears and phobias, all coming within a woman that, on the same time, was hearing the voice of Jesus speak to her, some of the most beautiful words that have ever been given to the world, and then knowing full well that she couldn't integrate that in herself. I think that was a tremendous cross for her, and a source of deep pain for her too.
I've sometimes wondered, and this is highly personal for me, how I would have felt meeting her for the first time if she could have integrated that. Because a person like that would be so radiant, so transcendent, so perfect. I would have run. In a sense, again, I say for me, she was perfect the way she was. She was the perfect example to me of the ego in action on the one hand, fearful, unreliable, inconstant, always worried, and not very loving. On the other hand, she was the person who handed me that document, and she gave it freely, and she taught it to me. It couldn't have been better. The balance. I could see in her what I was, ego and Holy Spirit, and I could choose. If she was anything else, for me it wouldn't have worked.
There's a chapter title in the Course that's called God or the Ego, and I think that that's a perfect epitome of what Helen really was. She had both sides so clearly demarcated in herself.
I think that's right, Ken. Actually, about the time that Helen and I had finished the course, we went to a conference in southern France. And during that period, she related a rather extraordinary experience one night when she suddenly felt that she was surrounded by all of the light of the universe, that it was here in her chest, that it was reflecting out of her, that she could reach out and touch anyone, anywhere, and there was total ecstasy, total peace, a sense that...
and total love.
And total love, of course, something that, you know, one can't really talk about. But she was radiant, and the whole experience was a very glorious one. The following week, we were in London, and she had the exact antithesis of this experience while we were in London. She went into the extreme depths of darkness, a feeling of hell, a feeling that everything was dark and sordid, surrounded by evil, whatever that might be, but it was the total opposite. And when you're talking about heaven and Helen, I think that's really what this epitomizes.
There was her subway experience earlier in her life when she was on the BMT in New York, and she found herself hating all of the people in the subway car, and again filled with that tremendous sense of revulsion that she could feel sometimes towards people. And then suddenly the whole scene shifted, and she saw herself walking to a blinding circle of light, and she felt an arm come around her tenderly, and she knew that was the arm of God. And then she felt waves of love coming to her from God, and opening up her eyes, she saw these same people in a totally different way, and that light of love that she felt coming through her now embraced everyone in the subway car. It was exactly that same kind of experience, God and the ego.
I was thinking as we were talking about the very end of her life. And I saw her, I guess it was 2 weeks before she died. And I didn't quite know what to say to her, what to be to her, what to do. She was so obviously dying, and of course extremely unhappy. Not in a terrific amount of pain, though.
Not physical pain. Right?
No, but emotional pain was incredible. And I sat next to her, again on the couch in her living room, and I was holding her hand, and she was not responding to me. I knew she knew I was there, but she wasn't acknowledging me. It was as if she preferred to be in her own pain rather than include me in her love. And one moment when I was thinking, at that very second, I think I should go home. There is no reason for me to sit around here anymore just holding her hand and being ignored, and she had enough help in the house to care for her. She suddenly looked at me with a very alert and shrewd even expression on her face. And she said to me quite candidly, "Do you know why I'm dying?" And I was taken aback, and I didn't quite know what to answer. And I said, "No, I don't, Helen. I really don't know why you're dying." And she sighed for a moment, and there was this looking directly into my eyes. And she said, "To get out of its way." And I knew absolutely that she meant to get out of the way of the course and its development and where it was to go, to take her ego out of the scene, because we were also affected by it. And perhaps if she stayed around, we might not have been able to do our work.
I think that was an example, in fact, a rather strange example that expressed the kind of purity and integrity that Helen had. I think that there was a part of her which recognized that since her ego always had to be center stage, and she was such a dominating personality, I think that's only everybody's experience who has met her, that if she let that happen with the Course, it would be one of the most biggest mistakes she could ever have made, because there was a part of her personality which really had to dominate. And it's so clear in the Course that the Guru is the Holy Spirit or Jesus and not a particular person. And I think that on some level, it was her way of protecting the Course from her own ego. And I think there was a part of her which knew that. And again, I think that despite all of her ego problems and her anxieties and fears, there was another part of her which remained very faithful to that function which she felt that she had. And I think that that's probably what impressed most of us who knew her.
No question. Yeah. I think her integrity was always compelling.
Yes. And nothing of her ego really got in the way of the Course.
I also think at the very end of her life, she knew that she'd finished, that she had come for a purpose, that she fulfilled it, and what was there left? And so she left.
Mm-hmm. Helen always used to say to me that Jesus told her that when she died, he would come for her. And Helen lapsed into a coma on the morning that she died. We took her to the hospital, and she never recovered. But all day, she was in obvious pain, and you could just see that on her face. And Louis and I were at the hospital until about 8 or 9 o'clock, and then Louis wanted to go home. And so we got home, and then 2 hours later, the call came that Helen had died, and we rushed back up to the hospital. And she was still in the hospital bed, dead, and she had such a peaceful look on her face. And it was actually one of the very few times I could recall Helen looking that peaceful. So that I think Jesus did come for her, just as he said, and she knew that. And I think that the radiance you're talking about, Judy, I think was coming from that.
It's a happy ending to a job well done.
Right.